Hi everyone, good to see you on my channel today. Today I will tell you a wonderful story. It is full of love and kindness. I hope you enjoy it and I wish you an enjoyable viewing experience. Thank you.
Mom, why didn't you tell me at once that grandfather had died? I would have gone to say goodbye to him, resented Jack, who returned from a business trip and only learned about the tragic event in the family. That's exactly why I didn't tell you. Everyone knows that your grandfather was a crazy man. We don't know how many other things he did after we left him to live alone. Why would you want to get involved in this filth? Replied Selene. It's not true. When I went to see him as a child on vacation, he told me himself that he had many dangerous enemies and they would stop at nothing. He really wanted me to believe him and to be aware of all his developments. What kind of schemes could there be, son? He was practicing the usual quackery. I mean, where do you see dead animals being used to make a cure for everything? It's a load of crap. And by the way, all the most powerful drugs were created that way. You just don't know the details. Well, they must have been created by professionals, son. Your grandfather was an engineer, not a scientist or a pharmacist. Psychiatrists said that he got carried away in his business, started experimenting with some forbidden substances, and inhaled their vapor. After that, he had a delusion that he'd invented the elixir of eternal youth. It all adds up. Don't argue. Selena tried to distract her son. I don't believe all those psychiatrists or even those policemen who accused him of heinous crimes. My grandfather was an enthusiast. He was an unrecognized genius. There are no such works as his developments anywhere else. And it's terrible that you and your father didn't stand up in his defense, but believed his enemies. Jack continued indignantly. Son, you better eat and rest. Don't fill your head with trifles, his mother said, and put another plate of delicacies in front of him. But Jack didn't feel like eating at all. The news that his beloved grandfather had died 6 months ago, and he was only being told about it now, upset him greatly. And he remembered his grandfather well. And his mother won't let Jack go to his grandfather's funeral, saying he was crazy, and for more money she won't let Alexander go. Jack was 5 years old when he first met his grandfather. It's true what people say, he's a bit touched. He was kicked out of his job a long time ago. He was in jail. Everyone turned their backs on him. He was in a mental institution for several years. What inheritance are we talking about, except his old house with the rats and toads? Indeed, my grandfather kept many different kinds of toads in a separate shed near the house. He fed them a special diet, groomed them, and even talked to them. Grandmother, when she still lived with him, constantly resented this. But grandfather regularly went somewhere and then returned with new kinds of frogs. Then no one understood what idea this man was living and where it would all lead to in the end. Jack ate the lunch his mother had prepared. Just as he was about to go play on the computer, his mother said to him, Jack, wash the dishes behind you and then go to the store to get groceries, money, and a list on the table. Mom, how many times can you do this? I'm not a teenager or a child. I'm almost 30 years old, and you keep chasing me around the house chores. He resented it again. That's fine if you realize that you are almost 30. Then get married, buy an apartment, and then for you all these things will do your children. In the meantime, you'll do it yourself. Son, his mother stroked his head, barely reaching the top of his head. While Jack went grocery shopping, all the way he thought about how to tell his mother that he was going to put their apartment in the bank. Surely she'd be against it. His father even more so. But that shouldn't stop Jack. He's recently finished his exclusive construction engineering project. He should definitely realize this vision. Then he and his family can buy dozens of these apartments. Mom, I have a business proposal for you, he said, putting food in the refrigerator. Well, go ahead, Mom replied indifferently. My unique engineering project for construction projects will bring on average up to 50 million rubles a year. but for its promotion needs a little money, only 3-4 million. I propose to mortgage our apartment and the bank and take out a loan. And then I'll buy you and your father 2 of them within the year, Jack said. You and I have had this conversation before, so you better forget it. If your father hears, he'll be upset. Don't get it wrong, son. Who would want your designs? There's so many of them now. You don't have to take so many risks. The main thing is that your salary is paid on time. You don't need anything, so hang on to that. Jack didn't expect any other answer. His parents have no interest in the size of his business. But if his grandfather were around now, he'd be willing to help. What about his inheritance, by the way? He promised, didn't he? Jack decided to talk to his parents about it another day. But the next day, Jack got a call from the notary and was told that his grandfather had bequeathed his house to him. Since 6 months had already passed since his grandfather's death, it was time to inherit the house. Jack was not particularly happy. How much could a house in the country be worth? Not even 1 million. So this case is unlikely to change anything in his life. But it was not to be. A few days later, Jack decided to go to his grandfather's house. He doesn't remember the address very well. It's been 23 years since his father gave up on his grandfather Alexander and left, slamming the door, all because of his grandfather's reputation. Jack, Billy's father, thought it was a disgrace that Grandpa Alexander had barely served his time in prison, and then got involved in some dark business with his developments, for which they decided to put him in a psychiatric hospital. Complaints were written against him. He was constantly checked. He was considered a fraudster who launched a huge scam with some miracle drug. That was the story Jack remembered about his grandfather. And yes, unfortunately, all relatives, neighbors, and family friends believe that version of the story. He loved his grandfather very much. All through his teenage and adult life, he had waited for the day to come when they would meet again. His grandfather had told him many interesting stories as a child. He taught him to dream bigger, not to betray his dream under any pretext. And of course, he believed more than anyone else that Jack would definitely become a master of his favorite business. Against the background of his parents, who were always imposing their will, his grandfather was a fresh breath of air for Jack. It had been almost a month since he had learned of his death, and a huge void had formed inside him. Now there would never be any meetings, no heart-to-heart talks with him. Jack was resentful of his parents, knowing his love for his grandfather. They hadn't informed him of his death, hadn't allowed him to see him off, and hadn't even been present. It must have been very painful for his grandfather to witness from heaven such indifference of the closest people. Jack took a cab from the local bus station and went straight to the local cemetery. There he easily found his grandfather's grave. There wasn't even a monument on it. He promised himself that soon he would put up a decent monument. In the meantime, he sat at the headboard of the lonely grave and tears flowed from his eyes. He apologized to his grandfather for not being attentive enough to him, for not once having come to visit him during all these years and not taking an interest in him. When he was tired of heavy thoughts and tears, he said goodbye to his grandfather's grave. Jack had no trouble finding his grandfather's house. It is the largest in this village. When he approached the gate, he saw a car nearby and a strange man. There were some people sitting inside the car. When Jack was about to open the gate of his grandfather's house, the strange man ran up to him. "Excuse me, has Alexander arrived too? We've been looking for him for so long." "Don't you know he's dead?" Jack asked. "Dead? We really didn't know. May he rest in peace. He told us to come to him at this time. Our baby, after his treatment, was beginning to come back to life. We had a little more to go. Do you know where to get Alexander's medicine?" The strange man asked. "What kind of medicine are we talking about?" "The elixir of health. The whole country comes here for it." "I don't know anything about it," Jack said and hurried inside the courtyard. There was nothing in the yard. Grandfather was very fond of order. It was obvious that he kept his territory in perfect condition until the end of his days. Jack opened the front door and stepped inside the house. Inside the house also looked like a secret laboratory. Snow-white walls and heavy black curtains, old furniture that still had its luster. And of course, 2 large rooms, ceiling to floor, filled with books. Jack was tired from the road today, so he decided to just rest, staring at the black and white television. He didn't notice how he dozed off in his grandfather's chair. In his dream, his grandfather came to him. He greeted his grandson at the entrance to the kitchen. He was very happy to see him. Then the grandfather led Jack somewhere in the backyard of the house, where there was a huge wooden gate with golden handles. "Open it, Jack, it's all yours," Grandpa said. Jack barely had time to touch the handles before the gate opened by itself. Then he could not believe his eyes. It was a sparkling world with all the colors, a lot of people around, no end to the crowd was visible, all rejoicing and thanking someone. In a distant corner of the crowd, Jack's parents were standing, somehow angry and upset about something. Behind them stood some strange men in dark masks. While Jack was admiring the glittering new reality, he didn't notice how the black-masked men grabbed his grandfather and took him far away. The grandfather managed to take something out of his pocket and throw it at Jack's feet. "Go on with my business," he shouted, leaving with the strangers. Jack woke up to a rustling sound outside. He looked at the clock, only it was midnight. His grandfather's words, "Carry on my business," resounded in his ears. What business are we talking about? People close to him think he's a fraud and a charlatan. It's all strange. Jack went into the kitchen and ate some of the food he had brought with him. The strange rustling, which sounded like a working mechanism, didn't stop. He decided to deal with it tomorrow. Tonight he went to bed. The next morning he woke up to the fact that there was a significant noise in the house. Jack can't find the source of the noise. He walked around the house, looked in all the rooms, only then remembered about the basement. During his lifetime, his grandfather tried not to let anyone into the basement. His grandmother and other relatives jokingly said that he had some ghosts living there. Little Jack believed these words and was really afraid of the basement. Now he was going down the tall concrete stairs. He guessed right. The noise was coming from the basement. The door was padlocked. Jack opened it with great difficulty. When he got inside, he was stunned by what he saw. It was a laboratory, fully furnished with professional equipment. The lighting dazzled his eyes. The inside of the room was as sterile as an intensive care unit. And most importantly, several devices, incomprehensible to Jack, were rhythmically working and pumping out some kind of liquid into various glass bubbles. It's been almost 8 months since his grandfather's death. How is it that all of these devices continue to run continuously and properly? That the equipment starts up with the lights in the house, Jack learns later. In the meantime, he was looking at the formula of that mysterious liquid, for which his grandfather was in jail and in the asylum, for which people from different parts of the world continue to come and look for Grandpa Alexander. There was an old notebook on the table. Jack opened it and found a note in it marked, "For my grandson Jack." He rejoiced. His grandfather had remembered him all his life. The grandfather went on to write in his letter that Jack should contact Carlo, who lived on the next street in this village. Jack had trouble remembering Carlo. He seemed to have worked with his grandfather. He watched the wonders of his grandfather's work for a long time, and then he was about to leave. When he reached the door, someone from behind called out to him. "So you're his grandson," came a woman's voice. As Jack turned back to find the silhouette, goosebumps ran down his spine. He broke out in a cold sweat. Turning back, he saw Eva, the same girl who had accompanied his grandfather all his life and helped him on all his exploratory adventures, appear from the far corner of the room. "Yes, and you are Eva. I remember you," Jack said, and was horrified at the memory. 23 years ago, Eva had looked like a girl of 25. Now she looked exactly the same. She's wearing the same white robe, her hair gathered back, holding a lamp in her right hand and squinting. She comes quite close to Jack, and then he gets a good look at her face. Indeed, it shows no sign of time. "Do you know why you are here?" Eve asked in a shrill voice. "Because my grandfather willed it all to me." Jack struggled to get the words out. "That's right. This house and this cellar are yours, of course. But there's something you'll have to deal with," Eve said. "What do you mean?" Jack asked. "I can't tell you everything in advance. You have to draw your own conclusions, especially since your grandfather gave you the key to understanding the problem when you were 5 years old. Now, go to Carlo and tell everything you saw here," said Eva. Jack headed for the exit, all shivering with fear and the incomprehensible cold. As he closed the front door of the cellar, Eve said to him, "Lock the door from the outside." Jack decided to visit his grandfather's friend Carlo, who lived 2 streets away. Grandpa Carlo welcomed Jack with joy, although he didn't recognize him right away. After Jack introduced himself, they sat on a bench in his yard and had a conversation. "Your grandfather was a unique man. It is a pity that he had many enemies." "Who were his enemies? Who could he hurt so badly?" Jack asked. "Oh, Jack, if you only knew. His enemies were almost everyone who had anything to do with medicine. He was first imprisoned on false charges, then they appropriated his work and tried to profit at your grandfather's expense. When he did his prison time and was just going to do the research for himself, he was locked up in a psychiatric hospital. So my grandfather wasn't really crazy." "No, of course not. Psychiatry is a classic way of eliminating undesirable people. It's been around for a long time. No one counted how many brilliant minds were destroyed within the walls of mental hospitals. But I did everything I could to prevent them from turning your grandfather into a vegetable. I went and negotiated with a doctor for money not to give your grandfather strong psychotropic drugs. I couldn't get him out of there right away. I had to wait for his enemies to calm down." "Did he come out of psychiatry healthy?" "Yes, they managed to save him from that scourge. But when he got out, nobody wanted anything to do with him. Even your grandmother left. Her fellow villagers gagged her for being the wife of a charlatan, for feeding and clothing her with charlatan money. They also did a good job on your father. He was indoctrinated that his father was mentally ill and a danger to society. Your father believed it and cut ties with him." "How did my grandfather spend his last days?" Jack asked. "He wasn't sick. He walked on his own 2 feet until the very last. He got up early in the morning, cleaned up around his house, fed the street cats and dogs, took care of orphans and other old people. And of course, he read and worked very hard. I didn't meet him on the last day of his life." Carlo concluded his conversation. "As for the manuscript, he really wanted the records to fall into safe hands, and he trusted no one but you. And there was no one else close to him. You should read these notes carefully. There should be hints for further actions," said Grandpa Carlo. "Grandpa Carlo, please tell me, what is the uniqueness of my grandfather's development? Why is there so much noise around it? In the 2 days that I live in his house, several people have already come to buy this drug or to meet my grandfather. This drug was created for children. Your grandfather had 2 younger siblings in his family. But those were different times. Back then, there were a lot of epidemics. Any epidemic could take the lives of children. If one child got sick, the rest of the children in a family could get sick, and everyone would die. Your grandfather saw his own parents suffer from it as a child. Then, after your father, he had 2 more children who also died of the disease. Your grandfather cried for a long time after the death of his young children. Then he began to study the peculiarities of medicines for children with cancer, and eventually he found some ancient recipe and formula. To make his remedies, he searched for a special kind of toad, then dried them under the sun and made a liquid concentrate from this substance. The remedy was so strong that it could stop almost any disease, including cancer. Why didn't he work as a scientist then? He was an enthusiast. He thought of himself as a small man. If he went to the big city, the world of big science would welcome him with joy and honor. Jack was shocked by this news. He didn't even know that his grandfather was involved in such secret and dangerous research. Carlo said that he didn't know what had happened to Alexander, but Grandfather Alexander had left a note in his manuscripts describing his work on a secret cure. Grandfather Alexander was one of the top engineers in his small organization, but at some point he became fascinated with researching and working on this drug. Jack was shocked by Grandfather Alexander's story, and it became apparent to him that the man had been unfairly accused and harassed because of his developments. He decided that he had to do everything he could to prove Grandpa Alexander's innocence and restore his reputation. Grandfather Alexander was the son of a famous witch doctor in his village. In those days, medicine as modern people know it did not yet exist. Little Alexander was told by his mother that she inherited the gift of healing from her grandmother. Grandfather Alexander remembered the legend of his family all his life. A long time ago, there lived a king named Bortig, who had a sole hair. In those times, epidemics of plague and other terrible diseases were frequent. Small children suffered the most. It was a great luck for a child if he survived such epidemics and did not die before reaching the age of 10. When the little Tsarevich Bortig was born, the king ordered that the baby be protected from disease as much as possible. The king built a separate palace for his son, where only the closest people could enter, and they should not come closer to the prince than 7 steps. This was considered a safe distance to avoid contracting terrible diseases. The king was right. When the prince was 12 years old, a terrible plague broke out in the kingdom. People were dying right on the street, their bodies were rotting there, and only specially trained guards in protective suits could approach them. In a few days, bodies were lying all over the streets of the city, and the smell of corpses enveloped the entire city. The king gave orders to immediately gather the best healers from all corners of the country and come up with a curative remedy. The healers studied ancient recipes, incantations, and prayers. Some looked for a solution in the mountain herbs and sent soldiers from the king's army to find healing herbs. But all efforts were in vain. People continued to die, some in the street, some in their homes. Children were very vulnerable to this epidemic. Before the next new moon, not a single child was left in the city. They all died of the terrible disease. People went to the central square in the city and demanded that the king do something to save the people. The king himself was in sorrow, for the healers and mendicants were beginning to give up. Then a modestly dressed peasant woman came out of the crowd and said that healing should be sought in water. No one knew this woman, but for the sake of salvation they decided to listen to her. The healers asked her what exactly to look for in water. Then the woman answered, "Perhaps it is a toad." The king was outraged, and the healers and mendicants twisted their fingers at the temple, looking at this woman. According to the belief of this people, one should not consume a toad as food. It is considered a great sin. The people decided that the woman was mocking them in this way. It must be a demon disguised as a woman and had come to lead them astray. The king ordered the woman to be executed. But the woman insisted until her last breath that the healing cure for the worst of human diseases was hidden in the surface of the water. As the executioner was cutting off the woman's head, he saw another young woman emerge from her body, leave her former body and disappear among the crowd of people. Before disappearing from sight, this mysterious young woman also said that healing was hidden in the upper layer of seawater. This story reached the sage of the city. He was very angry. God himself had sent salvation to the people through the lips of that woman, and they had taken her and executed her. The wise man ordered to find the girl into whom the woman's soul had turned. The people who were left alive were now looking for that girl. When the sage gathered them around him and asked them, they all said with one voice that they had seen this girl. She was tall, wore her hair loose, and held a live toad in her hands. Despite exhausting searches, the townspeople could not find the girl. When the people realized that the king could not save them from this terrible scourge of epidemic, they revolted. A mob of people, who were losing their minds from the number of dead people in the streets of the city, attacked the king's palace. The mad mob quickly destroyed the palace, and the king himself was seized to ask him for preserving the lives of the people. The king could not find anything to answer them in his own defense, so the mad mob killed him. Taking advantage of the moment, the enemies of the people stormed the city, and while they were killing their king, the enemies captured the palace of the prince. When the people came for their prince to put him on the throne, they found the palace empty. The enemies kidnapped the prince and placed him in a mountain cave. The prince, who was not accustomed to interacting with living people, fell ill with an incomprehensible ailment. He dried up in the cave all alone. Then a girl with a toad in her hands appeared in front of him and left her toad next to the suffering prince. There was an insane heat. After a while, the toad died, and then it rained. Raindrops fell on the dead body of the toad and turned it into a dark liquid. The prince at that moment began to have a death agony. He was very thirsty, but there was no water nearby. So he gathered all his strength in his fist and decided to drink from the small lawn that had formed around the dead toad. The next morning, the prince woke up healthy. He managed to escape from the cave and return to his city. When he arrived in the city, he went straight to the sage and told his vision, how the girl with hair had come to him and how she had left the toad behind. The sage interpreted everything correctly. This girl is the health goddess of the ancient peoples, wants to point out the right solution. The sage also said that she usually does not come to just anyone. The gift of a healer is not given to every person, and if it is, a person must devote himself to saving other lives, as this prince did. And whoever prevents this will be punished by God himself. That girl was Eve. No one knows what the girl would call herself, but if she appeared somewhere, it means that healing is near. This is how Alexander's grandfather's mother told her story and passed this property on to her son before she died. Many years later, when Alexander was already an adult and forgot about his mother's instructions, he suddenly saw Eve and remembered this legend. Only a few days passed and Alexander had the formula for his unique drug in his head. He knew that Eva was guarding the remedy quite tightly. Sooner or later, she would make sure the right people were saved. There was no one to tell the whole story, as many people stopped communicating with grandfather Alexander on the grounds of his research. Upon his return to the city, Jack followed his grandfather's instructions, which he had left with the manuscript. He contacted Global Health, an international company. The Global Health representatives were excited when they heard Alexander's last name. It turned out that they were already familiar with his developments. 10 years ago, they tried to get him to buy his developments and fund his research, but some people got in their way and prevented them from doing so. We thought we had lost contact with this man forever, said Angelica, the responsible manager of the company. As a matter of fact, it was so. There was no one left near him. I don't understand by what miracle he kept his records. I think our company will definitely deal with this development. Now you need to leave them to us, and we will contact you within a week, Angelica said and escorted Jack out of the office. But he didn't have to wait a week for a call. Or she called in 2 days and set a meeting in the presence of the head of the company. Jack showed up for the meeting with the company executive. At the meeting, the executive stated that they were buying out his grandfather's manuscripts to do more research and possibly mass market his drug. Jack was glad that at least something nice had been done for his grandfather, albeit retroactively. But he still didn't realize the magnitude of this success. The supervisor advised Jack to go to the office's economics department. When he entered the department, the chief accountant asked him, "Do you prefer to settle in cash or by transfer?" "I don't care. Give me cash since I'm here," Jack said. Then the head accountant asked him to wait outside. After quite some time, she asked him into the office and offered to sign the paperwork. Jack almost fainted when he saw the 7-digit figure for the value of his grandfather's manuscript. "I'm sorry, is there a mistake in those figures?" Jack decided to check just in case. "No, there's no mistake. This is the average cost of such a development," replied the chief accountant with an indifferent look. Jack signed the accounting paperwork and was pointed to 2 solid suitcases that stood in the corner of the accounting department. Both suitcases were filled with money. This was the first time Jack had ever seen this much money. He was surprised at how quiet the accounting staff and the company in general were about it. It seemed like a typical office of 4 cubicles. It would seem that ordinary people who walk among ordinary people are working, but it turns out that they are handling such money. And so calmly, so casually. Jack lifted the 2 suitcases from the floor with an effort and headed for the exit. He still couldn't believe what was happening. His mind was now occupied with one question. Where should he go now, and where should he hide the money? It was dangerous to carry it home because his parents might cause trouble. And what if he takes it to the bank in this form? But after consulting with a friend, he decided not to keep the money in the bank. Instead, he found a secluded place in his friend Mike's garage and hid the money there. Lastly, he took 1 pack of bills with him, and he and his friend went to spend this evening in a special way. True, Jack had no idea that from that day on his life would be completely different, and he should have been ready for it. Only Eva knew the essence of what was happening, but when she approached Jack to talk about it, he was sitting at the bar and was very drunk. "Girl, if you want to meet me, you don't have to be so smart," Jack said, and grabbed her by the waist when she tried to pass something important from her grandfather. Eve knew human nature well, being not human herself, but this rapid change in Jack upset her. Rather than waste her time on this arrogant young man, she decided to issue a major warning. "Jack, don't forget yourself. You have a great responsibility. Don't let your grandfather down. You were his only light in the window," she said. "Oh yes, my grandfather was a brilliant man, and I've seen that again today. Thanks to him, I'm set for 3 lifetimes to come." "Guys, let's drink to my grandfather," said Jack, and asked the waiter to bring more cocktails and champagne. After a raucous party, Jack woke up in a hotel room with 3 strange girls in the same bed. He noticed a terrible headache. To relieve it, he went down to the bar on the 1st floor of the hotel. There he met his friends from the night before. The hangover lingered for a long time. After a lot of drinking, Jack remembered that he was still an employee of some small office. This made him laugh, especially at the amount of money he now owned. So, he immediately went to his management, wrote an application and demanded to sign the application at that very second. Of course, Jack refused the paycheck settlement. He left his job without looking back. Now his plans were to visit his parents' home one last time to take the essentials from there. And in the near future with his parents will be a completely new format of relations, where Jack has complete freedom, and his parents take into account his opinion. If they are against it, Jack will reward them with expensive gifts. With such dreams, he opened the front door to his apartment. But the apartment door was unlocked. Jack didn't think much of it, but it didn't last long. His gaze fell on the apartment. Everything had been turned upside down. A huge burgundy stain peeked out from under the door in the living room. Jack sobered up immediately when he saw it. When he entered the living room, he found his mother lying face down, and then he found his father on the balcony, also face down. It was useless to do anything. The police arrived a few minutes later and started investigating. "They were looking for money," said one of the policemen. The words gave Jack goosebumps, and a chill went down his spine. He immediately realized what kind of money they were talking about. Though maybe something else was important to them, his grandfather's manuscripts. But the speed at which his grandfather's enemies had scratched out all of Jack's actions and had already managed to do him harm dumbfounded him. What kind of strong criminal group must this be to act so quickly and ruthlessly? It seems that grandfather was indeed a complicated man. The police, of course, did not know the true motives behind this brutal crime. They wrote in their paperwork that it was a simple robbery for profit. The criminals were looking for money, but could only find a small savings of Jack's parents in the apartment. Apparently, the money was not enough for them, so they scattered it on the floor and left, crushing everything behind them. Jack realized that every minute was now playing against him. On one side was an unknown group with very long arms and sharp eyes. On the other side were the cops, who, in the process of interrogation, might find out what secrets Jack had managed to hide in the last few days. He had no time to lose. To consult on his next course of action, Jack went again to Grandpa Carlo's house. He was very frightened, so no matter how much Eva circled around him, trying to catch his eye, whether at a gas station or a roadside cafe, he never saw her. And she was in a hurry to get the clue. Jack went to Grandpa Carlo's house and told him what had happened. How fast they act. Grandpa shook his head. What should we do next? What do you suggest? Jack asked. One thing is obvious. They will find you. They're very interested. They don't want money. They want the manuscripts themselves. They fought so hard to get it away from your grandfather. But you did a good job of realizing his dream quickly by getting his design into wide release. Now you need to save yourself. The only way I can see is to flee. You must flee the country, said Grandpa Carlo. At that moment, someone knocked on his window. Jack was terrified. What is this habit of knocking not on the door but on the window? He was indignant with fear. Don't be afraid, it's a sign. It's Eva, Grandpa said, and went to open the door. Jack heard his grandfather talking to the mysterious girl. Carlo, are you out of your mind? Can't you see he's green and stupid, and he'll do so much trouble that he'll get himself killed? He'll ruin himself at the same time, and our Alexander doesn't want that very much. Therefore, wherever he runs, you should go with him, said the girl. How? I'm old, I have a house, a household. Why don't you go with him yourself? You are forever young and can do anything. It will be easier for you to protect him, said the grandfather. Then the grandfather stood at the door for a while, resented that this girl would never listen to him, and went back into the house. So, Jack, it's settled. Goal number 1, you need to flee the country. Goal number 2, I need to be by your side at all times, said Grandpa Carlo. Who were you talking to, Grandpa Carlo? It was Eva, you know her. She's everywhere, but I don't have time to explain it to you now. You help me pack. You and I have to leave by tonight. I'll tell you the rest later, if we're alive and well, Grandpa Carlo said. Jack helped his grandfather to pack, and together they went to the nearest train station. Now they need to get back to the city as quickly as possible. Jack must drop by his friend's garage, put the money in the bank account, and quickly hide their tracks. On the outskirts of the city there is a grey building, in the yard of which there is a colorful children's yard. The yard is decorated beautifully. There are swings and slides and clean sand scattered for the youngest. Cute statues of cartoon characters are installed, but this playground is empty most of the time. Children look at it from afar, being in the wards of the hospital with grey walls, the oncology ward. Here there is a fight for life that has not yet begun. The day when the parents of these children first heard their diagnosis divided their lives into before and after. Little Arnold is only 6 years old, but he's as calm as an adult. Mom, when I die, give all my toys to Cecilia in the next room, Arnold told his mother. It was not the first time Natalie had heard such phrases from her young son. No matter how hard she tries to distract him from these thoughts, he returns to the subject again and again. Baby, what makes you think you're going to die? We agreed that we would continue our treatment until the end and get out of here healthy, Natalie said, and held her son close to her. No, Mom, I heard on the playground that we are all hopeless here. If I die, you don't cry much, okay? Arnold continued to tear his mother's heart out. It wasn't the fact that the little boy was saying those words that hurt Natalie. What hurt more was the fact that such a fate is inevitable in these children. Everyone here knows that pediatric neuroblastoma very often ends in death. Only children with cancer are treated in this ward. The girl Cecilia was admitted just last week. She's only 7 years old. For the first few days, she didn't realize the atmosphere here. But once she went to the playground, she came back different. Her parents did not realize for a long time that the children on the playground were not only playing, but also talking among themselves about their illnesses and their immediate fate. Natalie's conversation with Arnold was overheard by her neighbor Alice. Alyssa has 4-year-old Austin in her arms, who was given a disappointing diagnosis 3 months ago. Since then, she has only lived in her home for a couple weeks. The rest of the time she spends here in the hospital. Arnolda, stop saying things like that. We're here to beat the disease. Look, Austin's been in treatment for 3 months, and he's doing much better. He sometimes goes to the playground and can even go on the slide, Alice said. She was trying to distract her roommate. I also heard that our treatment is very expensive. If I don't die, when I grow up I will earn a lot of money and buy my parents a new house, Arnold said when it came to the tumor medicine. As much as Natalie tried to hide the fact that she and her husband had to sell the house to pay for Arnold's treatment, he guessed it. Ever since he had heard about the sale of the house, he had been saying several times a day that he would make a lot of money and buy them a new house. This tore Natalie's heart even more. Alice's story is different. She has help from her parents. Besides Austin, she has 2 teenage children. They take turns visiting their little brother, helping their mom take care of him, and freeing up some time that Alyssa can spend on herself or just relaxing. Today, Alice is expecting Carolina, her oldest daughter. Even though Carolina is only 12 years old, Austin's diagnosis has forced her to grow up too. Alyssa felt her fatigue going beyond everything. Austin was in terrible pain every night. That's what happens when the disease has reached a certain stage and few medications can help anymore. Alice, you definitely need some rest. Why don't you call your husband and ask him to come over for a couple of hours and take care of the baby? Natalie tried to help only with advice, for lack of other options for help. But instead of answering, Alice was silent, staring out the window, then wiped the tears from her face, trying to hide them from little Austin. Caroline came in late and immediately began to play with her brother Austin. "Mummy, if you want to sleep here, you can go home and come back tonight," Caroline said thoughtfully. "My God, thank you that my daughter is so smart," Alice said and hugged Caroline. Then she turned to Natalie. "Natash, why don't Arnolda sit with Austin and Caroline while you and I take a walk to the nearest drugstore? We have a new list of medications to buy," she said. Natalie was glad, because it meant a lot in her situation to be able to walk outside for at least half an hour. Natalie and Alice left the children and went outside. Alice, who had been holding on with courage, was now sobbing at the top of her voice. Natalie did not ask any questions, as she knew the reason perfectly well. She just hugged her friend, and they stood like that for a while in the hospital courtyard. Alice cried for a long time, choking on her tears. Then she said, "Do you know that Robert left us?" "What? How so? Gone where?" Natalie couldn't believe what she was hearing. "He just took off, packed his things and left. Said he couldn't stand to see any more suffering. Maybe he just snapped out of stress. Maybe he'll stay with friends or his parents for a couple days, then come back. What kind of a person would leave his family with a seriously ill child?" Natalie was outraged, barely containing her emotions. "Natasha, you know very well that in our case it happens a lot. Men can't stand the suffering of their loved ones, and in the end, they decide to turn a blind eye and just leave." "I'm asking questions as if I didn't see it," Natalie said and hugged Alice again. "In fact, fathers leaving a family with a seriously ill child is another new facet of life for the residents of this hospital. Only last week, Natalie and Alice had learned that the woman in the next room had also told her husband that he could no longer bear the suffering and had gone to live with his parents. Alice was horrified by the man's actions and comforted her neighbor in every possible way. Not a week later, she found herself in a similar situation. In light of what was happening, Natalie watched her husband more and more closely. I wondered on what day he would snap and say he was leaving to avoid seeing his child suffer. Once here, she realized that this was not such a fantastic reality. They took a leisurely walk to the drugstore together. Natalie helped Alice to talk and cry. She returned to the room as if she'd gone for a walk. And how to tell little Austin that his daddy was not coming back was a tragic tale of its own. Caroline stayed with her little brother until evening. During that time, Alice was able to get some sleep. Natalie took Arnold out into the yard, but he wouldn't play. He was always drawn to heartfelt conversations with his mother. He usually talks about death. Less often he talks about the life he may not have. Natalie finds it very difficult to endure some of her son's questions, but it is also impossible to leave them unanswered. After Caroline left, the doctor came into the room. "Alice?" "Hello, doctor. I'm here. Is there any news for us?" Alice asked in an indifferent voice. "You could say that. I scrutinized your latest tests and decided to discharge you home. It's better that way. Babies feel better at home," the doctor said. "If you allow it, of course we'll stay at home. And our drug will be delivered in a couple of weeks. I think we will get it better in the hospital than at home, right, doctor?" asked Alice. Indeed, medicines for children with cancer are in great shortage in this city. When doctors prescribe them, many parents have to order them from a manufacturer abroad. On the other hand, it costs them less. Some drugs cost the price of a decent apartment in the city. Alice had a case in point. While she was in the hospital with Austin, her parents and other loved ones raised money from all over the world to keep her treatment on track. When Alice talked to the doctor, she was referring to a new dose of the drug she had already ordered. She's pinning all her hopes on this drug. Although there are no changes in Austin's health for 3 months, but the next dose can change the overall picture. That's what Alice thinks. "Alice, I want to be honest with you. Basically, you can cancel the new dose for now," the doctor said. "Doctor, what's this about?" The doctor was faced with a dilemma: to reassure Alice and lie to her that there is indeed an improvement, or to tell her that the unhappy end is near. The doctors in this situation are also uneasy. They realize that parents have the right to know the truth, whatever it may be. So, the doctor just shook his head and pretended to look away from Arnold. Alice still didn't want to believe in the hopelessness of her child's fate, but she didn't give up hope for healing. The next day, she checked out with Austin and returned to the home Robert had recently left, so she wouldn't have to see the agony of her family's suffering. She cancelled the drug delivery, citing that the doctor would have a definitive answer in a couple weeks. Meanwhile, at the hospital, other moms were whispering among themselves and looking sadly out the window. Little Austin had been discharged home, Natalie told another neighbor, Casey, the mother of the same girl, Cecilia. "What are you talking about? Oh my God, she worked so hard. They got the most expensive drugs and believed that they would make a difference. So it didn't work." Casey shook her head. "Do you also think that the treatment is just an excuse, an attempt to last a few more months and no more?" Natalie asked. "Since we've been living with cancer for almost 7 months now, I already know that you get discharged home when you don't have a chance. Doctors don't want babies to die in the hospital. First of all, it's extra scrutiny for them. Secondly, it will have a bad effect on the psychological state of other parents and babies. May God protect our Alice," said Casey. And she was right. Natalie and Casey had already forgotten about Alice, absorbed in their own tragedies. About a month after her discharge, Alice returned to the oncology ward, but she came back alone. She brought Austin's favorite toys with her to give away to other children. and the fact that her little Austin had died was guessed without a word, even by the little patients on the ward. While Alice was talking to her former roommates, another woman came in. She, too, had recently been discharged from here with her young daughter. When the other women saw her, they clutched at their hearts. Had this poor woman already buried her child? But Julia was in a different mood. "Girls, do you remember when some research professor came to talk to us about the drug? Well, I started digging into the drug, and I found out everything. Then we found this old man Alexander, and he gave us 3 vials. It was a stinky drug, but it helped my daughter. Now our little one has started to eat and to walk on her own." The latest tests showed that the tumor had halved in size, Julia said. She was joined by other women who had also heard such stories about Alexander's drug. It turned out that everyone had heard the same stories. This biological drug completely cures cancer in children. It is made by a lonely old man, whom the whole village thinks is crazy. After this conversation, all the mothers have a new hope. But they do not know that Alexander himself is considered dead, and his laboratory and the remnants of the drugs were in the hands of his ardent enemy's pharmaceutical mafia, which built its business on the supply of expensive drugs from abroad. Oligarch Mark is having a rest today in one of the best restaurants. His friends are arguing about who has the bigger and more prestigious island. "Mark, you told me that you've got your eye on a resort town too. When are you going to invite us to your vacation town?" Another oligarch, Stan, asked. "It will be soon, my friend, it will be soon. I'm just a little behind schedule. It's good of you to remind me of that," said Mark, and took his cell phone out of his pocket. Then Mark dialed someone's cell phone number, and he was quickly answered at the other end of the line. "Greetings, Comrade General. Well, what news do we have?" asked the oligarch. The general didn't seem to be doing very well, so he took a long time to explain something. His explanations were so long that Oligarch Mark began to get angry with him. "Comrade General, you don't tell me your problems. You yourself said that only professionals work for you, so come on, show it in practice. Otherwise, our common cause is failing. My guys tell me you're doing well in your mansion on the Indian Ocean. I'm happy for you, it's good for your health. But it will be a shame if you have to return this mansion to me," said Oligarch Mark. After a long conversation, he hung up the phone, but his indignation still persisted. "I'm outraged. A whole general. He has dozens of professional staff at his fingertips, and in the end they can't cope with one decrepit old man. Mark, maybe you need some help. My guys, you know they can handle anything. Just tell me who the old man is and what's wrong with him, and we'll take care of it," said Oligarch Stan. "No, it's dangerous. You could be spotted. This old man has already made international headlines. He's got his own cure for pediatric neuroblastoma. 5 years ago, we got a homemade vial of it and tested it in our labs. And what do you think? It's 100% effective. What's the matter, Mark? I out the rights to manufacture it," said Stan. "I wish. This old man is so stubborn that he's been insisting for years that he wants to sell the rights to my competitors at Global Health because they'll settle for a small margin. It's like a charity of crazy proportions. And can you imagine the money that's being lost in the process?" Mark said, and there was an unhealthy glint in his eyes. "Of course, we are talking about the money from the production of the strongest drug for children's oncology. Alexander has been fighting all his life to keep his development out of the hands of the pharmaceutical mafia, which will profit at the expense of other people's misfortune. Mark's father tried to persuade his grandfather to sell his development. He was behind the false accusation that put Alexander's grandfather in prison for 7 years. He was behind the long story that eventually landed Alexander's grandfather in a psychiatric hospital. And then already Mark made sure that everyone considered grandfather a charlatan and a fraud and turned away from him. Mark promised grandfather Alexander astronomical sums, but he was stubborn. And now Grandpa Alexander, writhing in pain all over his body, lying in one of the underground chambers of the Special Services. General personally selected the best investigators to work with this stubborn old man. He needs to get his grandfather's manuscripts at any cost, otherwise Mark will have to return the luxurious mansion on the coast of the Indian Ocean. When investigator Tony entered the cell, Grandpa Alexander was able to open his eyes and sit down in a corner in the damp cell. "So, Grandpa, aren't you tired of talking back yet? I offer you a favorable deal. Now you and I will go to my office and talk amicably." "Guards, take him to my office," said the investigator and left the cell. "Get up, Grandfather," said the guard. "I'm not going anywhere," said Grandfather Alexander and tilted his head as if he was falling asleep. The guard believed his words because this grandfather has been lying in this cell for the 8th month and has never listened to a single command of the Special Services. The guard left the cell after a couple of minutes, returned with his partner. They took the grandfather by the hands on both sides and dragged him along the floor. The grandfather sometimes opened his eyes, tried to understand where he was, then fell back into a semi-conscious state. Then he found himself in the investigator's office. He was seated across from the interrogator and the guards went out the door. "Now, Alexander, if you remember, my name is Tony. You and I have tried to come to an agreement many times before, right?" Lieutenant Colonel Tony changed his tactics and tried to be as tactful as possible, but the grandfather didn't respond to his tricks. "Alexander, I'm offering you a good deal. All you have to do is tell me where your manuscript is. Our guys will do the rest. In return, you will get everything. Your reputation will be restored. The guys will make sure to tell everyone that you are not really dead, but were on a business trip. Most importantly, you'll get enough money to last you for 3 generations, the investigator said. "Listen to me, Tony. You go and work with real criminals, and do not touch me," said Grandfather Alexander. "Don't be in a hurry to say no. You haven't finished listening to me yet. You're dealing with very big people. You understand, this is not an equal fight. The strongest wins here anyway. Why are you risking your life like this?" Tony keeps pushing his grandfather. "Remember once and for all, I'm 84 years old. I've gotten everything I want out of life, and I've given life everything I can. Where do you see me struggling to live? There's only 2-3 more of your strokes on my kidneys left and my life will be dealt with," Grandpa said. Lieutenant Colonel Tony realizes the conversation is back on track, but he's not going to give up. "No, I've been in the police force for 20 years, but I've never seen a man as stubborn as you, Grandpa. Tell me, what are you clinging to? It's a pity that in 20 years of service and 8 months of knowing me, nothing good has come to you. What am I clinging to? I'm clinging to the right of little children to live." "Tony, do you have children?" Grandpa Alexander asked. "Yes, I have a son and a daughter. My daughter is a student. My son is about to finish school. And imagine that sometime 15 or 18 years ago, in the universe could happen one small glitch. That glitch usually occurs in one of the billions of cells in the human body. One of those billions goes astray during the process of division, and one single abnormal cell is born. It then begins to actively divide and multiply. Time passes and this cell turns into a cancerous tumor and already significantly interferes with the vital processes of the organism. And imagine that this organism could belong to your daughter or your son. It could happen to anyone. There are no rules. This disease doesn't choose a person. It comes into the lives of happy and carefree people like thunder, eventually takes that life to the grave, and then only settles down to become food for soil worms. Imagine if such a small glitch happened to your son or daughter. Then you would know the full tragic nature of existence. Meanwhile, right now, tens of thousands of young children are living with the very same abnormal cell that has managed to become a huge cancerous tumor and is pulling them closer and closer to the grave every day. I'm clinging to the fact that their parents can buy my drug as easily as they can buy their own headache medicine. Your big people want to sell this drug for the price of an apartment. And the fate of the drug depends on me, whether it will be available and cheap at all, or whether it will be available only and for a select few. That's what I'm clinging to, the grandfather said. Alexander, it is certainly very worthy that you fight for the rights of ordinary people. But let's be realistic. In what world and in what realities do we live? From the height of the bell tower of your age, you must realize that in any struggle, the strongest wins. That life is a struggle. If these people are destined to suffer, God will take care of their fate. After all, He's the one who gave them these trials. In your situation, you should be more accommodating and accept attractive terms. And if you keep resisting like this, the big men will want to go to extreme measures, said investigator Tony. Extreme measures is my life. Well, I've been telling you since day one, take it and calm down. They'll never get their hands on the prescription. Oh, Grandpa, what am I gonna do with you? Okay, if they want you dead. But there are a million other options between death and life, and they can be very unpleasant, said investigator Tony. I don't care if you cut me up in pieces and throw me to the dogs in the yard. I has insisted on my own, so I will stay at my own, said grandfather Alexander. The conversation between the investigator and the grandfather lasted almost 3 hours and ended with the defeat of the investigator. Lisowski had run out of options to influence this old man. 8 months of torture and torment did not yield any results. He applied on this decrepit old man all kinds of tortures that can only be in these walls. But the old man keeps repeating himself and has no intention of giving up. There is one other way, but it's irrevocable. No, it's not death. The big men who are behind all this trouble think that death is too easy a fate for those who don't cooperate with them. Upon arriving in Dubai, Jack and Grandpa Carlo were seated in one of the luxury hotels. Jack started the conversation first. Grandpa, look, you and I have a lot of money. We don't need to work. We have plenty of time. Do you have any idea how we will live our lives? Grandpa Carlo was waiting for this conversation. I don't know you can think of something to do, but I have a dream, replied the grandfather. And what is it? There is an actress so beautiful, Ilona Ford is her name. I would like to spend the night with her, said the grandfather. What? A night with Ilona Ford? Grandpa, your lip is not stupid, I respect, Jack said with surprise and laughed. What's so funny? Ilona is a normal girl, but she has no luck with her personal life. I've seen all her movies. She's a pretty girl, but she has no taste in men. All she gets is refined men, and then she's alone again. She'll see a real man in me, and then maybe our stars will align. Grandpa continues fantasizing. Jack is almost rolling on the floor with laughter. Grandpa, you're crazy. Why do you need one? They are fickle. Maybe you better find some good grandmother. I've had a million good women in my life, but Ilona is a dream. I don't know how long I have left to live, so I don't mind taking a swing at my dream. I read last time in a magazine that Ilona is now living here in Dubai. I'll take a couple of days off, get settled here, and go look for her, Grandpa Carlo said firmly. Jack laughed for a long time. I suggest you do the same. Right now, you'll probably want to maximize the money you have. But trust a grandfather who has lived a life. Money alone means nothing if you don't have a dream. You too, look for your Ilona, win her over. If she's quick, you'll take her to our village, buy her a cow, or better too. Then her brains will fall into place, the grandfather said. Jack realized that he would not be bored with this grandfather. After resting for a couple of weeks, Jack began to get bored. Then he decided to cautiously contact his friends and make contact with them. He didn't have many loyal friends. Jack was sure that none of them would give up his whereabouts. Not 2 days later, Jack received a call on his phone from his friend Mike's number. When Jack picked up the phone, he heard an unfamiliar voice on the other end of the line. Okay, kid, we've got your friend Mike. You have exactly 1 week to deliver your grandfather's manuscripts back to us in the US with your own hands. And if you don't, the death of your friend will be on your conscience, said the voice in the phone. Jack realized that these men with long arms had already gotten to his close friend Mike. He strongly regretted giving his phone number and contacting his friends. In a confused state, he told everything to Grandpa Carlo. The grandfather shook his head and said, "If your grandfather were alive, he would definitely think of something against them now. He managed to fight them all his life and never once gave in to them. Since he's not here, we'll have to wait for Eva. If the case is really serious, Eve will give us a sign about it," Grandpa said. "By the way, Grandpa, I've noticed that Eve is a bit mysterious. She finds a way to get in touch with you everywhere and anywhere. I used to notice her around my grandfather when I was a child. Almost 25 years have passed since then, and Eva is still a young girl." "What's the secret?" Jack asked. "The secret is that only humans grow old, and Eve is not a human being. It's a different essence," Grandpa replied in all seriousness. Grandpa Carlo is alone in a huge city. He had enough money in his hands. Jack thanked him generously for his grandfather's support and for himself. His loved ones are long gone from his life, and he will always have time to go to his village. In the meantime, his grandfather decided to have a good time. Favor. In this city, there were quite a lot of Russian-speaking people. The first thing, he went to a fashionable boutique men's clothing and asked a young girl to pick up for him modern clothes. The girls in the boutique among themselves giggled and laughed, looking at a simple grandfather with an avoska in his hands, because in his bag grandfather brought a magazine with him, in which there was a photo of one of the young modern actors in a stylish outfit. Grandpa wanted to dress just like that. The girls did not refuse to help him. As a result, the grandfather came out of the boutique in burgundy corduroy shorts, a mint-colored silk shirt, and ultra-fashionable sneakers. True, glasses and a cap like that guy's weren't here, but nothing grandfather will find them elsewhere, at the same time entertaining young people from another boutique. By the evening, the grandfather had already dressed with a needle and confidently approached girls and women of European appearance. "Girl, and your mother does not need a son-in-law." Grandfather said it with the maximum accent when a tall blonde passed by. Hearing his cute accent, the girl stopped for a moment and gave him her charming smile. "And if one is needed, who do you suggest? Or do you have a suitable grandson?" the girl asked. "You insult me, young lady. Why do you need my grandson? Young people, they are all infantile. And you need a real mature man like me. By the way, my name is Francis," the grandfather introduced himself. "My name is Aubrey. I'm a model. I live here all the time," said the girl and laughed at her grandfather's oddball feints. After they had exchanged a few bantering phrases, Aubrey asked how the grandfather had ended up here. Of course, Grandpa wouldn't tell her that he was sick of his village and his vegetable garden with its 3 goats. He would not say that this was where he was hiding from an organized crime group. Instead, the grandfather got creative. "I'm actually from Ireland myself, the Eiselberg dynasty. Maybe you've heard of them. My ancestors controlled the navy in the East and had great influence in the region. Thanks to their prudent policies, they were able to accumulate good capital. I, in turn, as a worthy descendant of the Eiselbergs, have managed to increase that capital. And now it's my time to enjoy life. That's why I'm here," Grandpa said. "Grandpa, are you rich?" Aubrey asked. "What questions, Daisy? In our circle of aristocracy, it is not customary to talk about it, but you are so beautiful that you are forgivable such cute oddities. Therefore, I will tell you as it is. I am very rich, but infinitely lonely," said the grandfather and sighed heavily. "Well then, it's dangerous for you to go alone in these parts, because there are so many rich women who are after you that they can easily seduce you, and then you won't find your way back to Ireland," said Aubrey, and began to laugh loudly at him. If the huntress is as stately and pleasant as you are, I would be very happy. And if you agree to have a cold cocktail with me, I'm ready to mark tonight as a red calendar day and celebrate all the next years for the rest of my life, Grandpa said. Aubrey realized that there would be no boredom with this grandfather. They ended up going to a nearby bar where they ordered themselves various drinks and talked about life. Grandpa Carlo was enjoying the fact that he was able to make up such beautiful and concise stories that he began to believe in them. The nice cocktail party ended with the continuation in Grandpa's room. The next morning, Grandfather woke up with a terrible hangover. Seeing a long-legged beauty sleeping with her face to the wall next to him, Grandfather got a little upset. It's all Ilona's fault. I've been faithful to her for so many years, almost since the death of my grandmother, Ariana. And she lurks somewhere and makes me run after her. The poet's soul has fallen into sin, Carlo muttered to himself. When he had gone a little, Aubrey woke up. Grandfather expected a scandal, saying that she had had too much to drink last night and had not meant to come here at all. But to his surprise, Aubrey was calm. She even went over to him, kissed him on the cheek, and ruffled his liquid beard. Francis, what are our plans for today? I'd really like to go shopping. Will you accompany me? Aubrey asked. Shopping is shopping, but you'll be buying not only what you like, but what I like too. What do you like? I saw some people on the beach yesterday wearing very thin swimsuits made of precious metals. I must say, it looks very aesthetically pleasing against the lovely female form. I think it would be perfect for you, Grandpa said. Aubrey, who had a headache from last night's drinking, had forgotten her condition and was laughing. After 25 years of living in the world, she had never met such a mischievous grandfather. And yes, Grandpa was careful to use a cute accent to make his legend sound as believable as possible. After a couple weeks of rest, Jack got bored. Then he decided to cautiously contact his friends and make contact with them. Loyal friends he didn't have many. Jack was sure that none of them would give up his whereabouts. Not 2 days later, Jack received a call on his phone from his friend Mike's number. When Jack picked up the phone, he heard an unfamiliar voice on the other end of the line. Okay, kid, we've got your friend Mike. You have exactly 1 week to personally deliver your grandfather's manuscripts back to us in the US. And if you don't, your friend's death will be on your conscience, said the voice in the phone. Jack realized that these men with long arms had already gotten to his close friend Mike. He regretted that he had given his phone number and contacted his friends. Jack lost his peace. If he went back, there was no guarantee that he wouldn't be captured. And if he doesn't act, he'll lose his friend. He's not yet healed from the loss of his grandfather and parents, and he's not ready to bury his closest friend. Grandfather, there's no point in sitting and waiting, Jack said resolutely the next day. I've already booked a plane ticket and I'll fly tomorrow. Whatever it is, I'm going to try to free Mike. I understand your worries, but how are you going to free him? Why don't you just go to the police? Yes, I'll go to the police. I'll ring all the bells until my friend is saved, Jack said. You're a fool, Jack. You still don't realize what you've gotten yourself into. The fact is that your grandfather's main enemies have always been the people from the organs. The mafia has always done their dirty work through the hands of the police. They're doing the same thing now. If you fly back, they'll probably catch you on some pretext, and you'll be a criminal. At the very least, and you can't do anything alone. Grandpa Carlo's right, too, but Jack couldn't just sit around and wait for the weather to clear. He left his grandfather the keys to the room and flew back to the United States the next day. All the remaining days Grandfather spent in his legend next to the beautiful Aubrey. On one of those days, he happened to meet a young man who kept talking into the on-camera of his phone. The young man introduced himself by the strange name Typhoon. When asked by the grandfather what he was doing here, he replied that he was a blogger. Grandpa didn't understand what that was, but pretty soon he wanted to be a blogger too. On Typhoon's live show, he asked Typhoon for advice on how he could become a blogger. Typhoon's viewers unanimously supported his grandfather's idea and advised him many options on how to become a blogger. During this time, Jack called his grandfather several times to ask for advice, but never got through because his grandfather was completely engrossed in his exciting new life as Francis Eiselberg of Ireland. And Francis of Ireland can't have any worries. So, he long ago left his button phone somewhere in a hotel closet and is now busy blogging. The blogger Typhoon and his grandfather have agreed that the latter will now appear on each of his live broadcasts. The nearest broadcast is scheduled for tonight at a restaurant in Dubai. When the stream went live, Typhoon's viewers started asking a lot of questions to Grandpa Francis. One of them asked what his dream was, to which the grandfather covered Aubrey's ears and stated that he dreams of spending the night with Ilona Ford. Typhoon's audience exploded with excitement, with the number of subscribers growing by the second. Typhoon promised his viewers that if by morning the number of subscribers reached 15 million, he would arrange a meeting on the live broadcast of Grandfather with Ilona Ford. So it happened. By the morning, the number of subscribers at Typhoon has passed far beyond 15 million. Now it's his turn to keep his word and organize a meeting of Grandfather with the famous actress. For the meeting with Ilona Ford, Grandfather bought new fashionable outfits. He came late to the meeting. The air was already running, and Ilona Ford was waiting for him next to Typhoon. As Grandpa walked into the restaurant, blogger Typhoon turned his camera toward him and asked everyone to greet Grandpa. "Grandpa Francis, here to meet you is Ilona Ford, that famous actress," said Typhoon. Grandpa froze for a moment, looked around, and then said, "That's it. And in the movies, she looks so stately and beautiful. But why now I see an elderly lady with wrinkles and overweight?" puzzled Grandfather. There was an awkward silence. Then blogger Typhoon turned everything into a joke and continued his broadcast. Ilona Ford did not take offense either, but just laughed at the grandfather's clumsy phrases. As a result, the grandfather earned a lot of money for the evening. Blogger Typhoon promised him in advance that if the live broadcast succeeded, he would pay an impressive sum. He kept his word. Grandpa took 2 large bundles of bills and gave one to Aubrey, and the second one was used to order gifts for Ilona Ford with home delivery. In the evening, he lay in a hammock in one of the private cottages and looked up at the sky. My dream had come true, all at the expense of my friend Alexander. May he rest in peace. I wonder what happened to Jack. I should call him and ask him if he was killed, Grandpa thought, and instantly forgot his thoughts. The general is unusually angry today because his guys still haven't solved the issue with Grandpa Alexander. Mark is already losing his temper and is ready right now to fly from his island on his private plane to deal with him face to face. Comrade General, I realized that you almost failed this case. Now do me a favor and make sure this manuscript doesn't get out, and do something with Grandpa to make sure this story ends. If we can't do it, no one else can, Mark said and hung up. The general breathed a sigh of relief. He was ready to give back the mansion on the Indian Ocean coast so that the story with this strange old man would be over. The general called investigator Sanikov to him and said, "You've lost the case. Mark is very angry with us, and your last task is to make sure that this manuscript doesn't turn up anywhere." "And how do we do that if we haven't found it?" Sanikov asked. "Use your head, Comrade Lieutenant Colonel. If there is no manuscript, then its source is still alive. It's the grandfather himself. If we let him go healthy, he will go and from memory can give a prescription for his drug. And for that, Mark won't spare us. So, Sanikov, think of something to make the grandfather finally forget the formula of his drug," the general said. The general's order was immediately carried out. 2 men came into the cell to Grandfather. In recent days, Grandfather Alexander had come to terms with his inevitable death and was extremely calm. It seemed that he had already gotten used to living with the severe pain he felt every day from the numerous tortures. When he saw the next visitors, he did not react to them in any way. "Grandfather, you have signed your own sentence," one of them said. "Now get up and follow us," said the other. Grandfather, as always, was very calm and obeyed the orders of the guards. Barely moving his swollen legs, he tried to follow the two officers. But after taking a couple of steps forward, he fell down from severe pain in his bones and from helplessness. Then one of the staff ordered the guards to bring him to the medical room. The two guards took the grandfather by the arms again and dragged him along the ground. The grandfather could barely comprehend what was happening and prayed faintly to God to take his soul as quickly as possible. But it was still a long way to the departure of his soul. Grandfather was led to one of the secret rooms. There was a young doctor waiting for him. He opened his safe and took out a vial of clear liquid. Then he took out a syringe and began to fill it with this liquid. "Hello, Alexander. There are such legends about you. And now I finally managed to meet you. You really are a legend, but the wrong legend. Therefore, today your fate will be decided." Wait. There really is a man lying there. But is he alive?" said Grandma Alexandra and came closer to the lying man. Both of them came close and saw quite a decent grandfather. They checked his pulse. The man was alive. It's just unclear why his arms and legs are swollen. As a result, the unconscious grandfather abandoned by the park was taken to the medical center of the nursing home. He came to his senses the next day. To all the medical staff's questions, he had one answer: "I don't remember." And indeed, Grandfather Alexander did not remember anything about himself. Neither his name, nor his place of residence, nor his past and the events of the last months of his life. Tell anyone now that this is the legendary inventor Alexander, who gave everything in his life for the sake of his invention. No one would believe it. On top of that, his health was in a badly shaken state. He would have been immediately registered as a permanent resident of the nursing home. But how to do it if a person cannot give his details? But it would be inhuman to throw him out on the street. The administration of the nursing home consulted among themselves and decided to keep his grandfather here until his relatives showed up. Jack sat down on a bench in the cemetery and sank into his thoughts. In front of him was a fresh grave with the flowers still dry. He glanced at his phone, then tossed it carelessly to the side. The last few days had been passing like a horror movie for him. The men who had captured Mike's friend had called him regularly to remind him of their demand. Jack tried to negotiate with them. He offered them ransom money for his friend Mike, but they insisted that they only wanted the manuscripts. Telling them that the manuscripts had already been sold to another company would have been doubly dangerous for him. It could have gotten him killed. He needed Grandpa Carlo's advice in those days, but he had never been able to reach him. Grandpa was busy with his exciting new life in those days. Eventually, at the appointed time, Jack received the lifeless body of his friend. True, the death of Mike and his parents remained a mystery. But now how could Jack live with this burden on his heart? He sat at his friend's grave and apologized for not realizing how he had gotten into this tangled story. "Mommy, even if I die, I'll wave to you every day from heaven," says little Cecilia when the terrible pains in her head subside. Casey only holds her daughter tighter against her and tries to wipe away her tears before her daughter notices them. "Baby, don't talk like that. Everything will be fine. Our medicine will be delivered soon, and you will get better," Casey repeats every day. In fact, Cecilia is well aware that she has a different fate in store for her. In the 2 months she has been in the oncology ward, at least 5 of her friends have been discharged, and she has not heard from them. Discharge is usually closer to the decisive moment. Cecilia had previously befriended Arnold. They became very attached to each other and promised to visit each other after discharge. There was a time when they could go out together to the playground in the hospital courtyard and play on the sandbox. And then Arnold got worse and worse, Lately, he even stopped standing up. The last time Cecilia saw him, he was lying in his mother Natalie's arms and was completely indifferent to the world around him. Little Cecilia had already realized that all the friends she found here would sooner or later go to heaven. They had talked about it many times in the sandbox. The adults deny it for some reason and won't talk to them honestly about it. Casey also knows that the expensive drug does not have any special therapeutic effect, but only prolongs her daughter's life. Every time the doctor enters the room, she looks at him with a shuddering heart and prays that she won't hear him say that they are being discharged home because there is no change. Then Cecilia would surely realize that it was her turn to go to heaven for her friends. She had said so herself more than once, tearing her mother's heart to pieces. As she sat in her heavy thoughts, someone knocked softly on the door of the room. Before Casey could get to the door, it opened and Natalie walked in. Seeing her, Casey was startled. Natalie and Arnold had been sent home a month ago, and now she was scared to ask the big question. What about Arnold? Natalie said hello and didn't hesitate to answer. I'm not coming to you empty-handed. Remember the old man who invented a 100% effective drug? Well, I got it, but it was only a little bit, but Arnold got better. You did? Where'd you get it? I'm ready to go there right now, Casey begged. You don't have to go anywhere. Here's a vial I poured you separately. It's very smelly because it's made from a concentration of dried frogs, but you can hold your daughter's nose with your fingers and let her drink it. You'll see. In 3 days she will start running, Natalie said. Natalie then said goodbye and hurriedly went home as Arnold was left alone. Casey immediately gave her daughter the first dose of the drug. Indeed, the odor was horrifying, but it was bearable when it was a matter of life and death. It's been a week. Tonight Cecilia slept soundly. Casey could not believe her happiness, only silently prayed to God and thanked that strange old man who invented this drug. After a few days, Cecilia had an appetite. For the first time, she asked for her favorite chocolate bar, which she had forgotten about 4 months ago. Then they took repeated tests, and the doctor found a noticeable reduction in the size of the tumor. True, Casey did not reveal the secret, as doctors react very keenly to Alexander's drug. After 2 weeks, Casey went to the doctor and asked to discharge them home, as Cecilia was already tired of the hospital walls and she couldn't wait to go back to her friends. This meant that death was cancelled and life, full of health and joy, took its place. And it was thanks to the work of that very odd old man Alexander. Grandpa Carlo spent last night as usual in a nightclub surrounded by young bloggers and his friend Aubrey. They went live and interacted with the audience several times throughout the evening. Ever since Grandpa met Ilona Ford live on air, the entire Typhoon blogger audience has loved him, and Grandpa is getting a high from it. He's already thinking about becoming a blogger himself. This morning he was awakened by an early call from Typhoon. Grandpa, we're going on a business trip. Senior Citizens Day is coming up. And my audience has already loved them after your appearance on my broadcasts, so we will fly together to some Russian nursing home, and you will broadcast live from there, said Typhoon. Grandfather asked his young friend to call back later and discuss everything slowly. Right now, he didn't have time for that. As soon as he hung up the phone and rolled over to his other side, he heard a knock on the door. Who's up this early? Grandpa Carlo muttered to himself and headed for the door. When he opened it, he finally remembered how he had gotten here. There was Jack in his life, too. He was standing right in front of him. Grandpa, are you crazy? Why aren't you answering my calls? Have you forgotten why and where I'm going? Jack attacked his grandfather, and without waiting for his invitation, burst into the room. Quiet, you'll wake Aubrey. So, what happened there? Grandfather asked. At that moment, Dashka woke up, stretching sweetly in bed like a cat. Francis, where did you go? Come back, I'm bored here alone, she said. I see you've made a nice life for yourself, Jack said, and shook his head. Grandpa shrugged. Aubrey became curious as to who Grandpa was talking to early in the morning. She got out of bed and walked into the living room. "Hello, Francis. Who's this?" asked the lovely creature, pointing her finger at Jack. "Francis, you mean?" Jack looked at his grandfather and could barely contain his smile. Grandfather stood there like a dumbfounded man thinking of ways to get out of this ridiculous situation. Jack took matters into his own hands. "Now, girl, there's no Francis. He's just a regular grandfather from Matvivka. So you can go on hunting for bigger sharks, and this one tricked you," Jack said. "I don't understand. What's going on here? Grandpa, is this true? Didn't you say you were from the Eiselberg dynasty from Ireland?" Aubrey asked in bewilderment. "A dynasty from Ireland?" Jack asked and laughed even louder. Outraged, Aubrey left without saying goodbye to her grandfather. As soon as the door shut behind her, Grandpa shook Jack's hand. "Buddy, you got here just in time. I'm tired of dealing with her, and I can't count the money I've spent on her," Grandpa Carlo said. "So that's why you didn't answer my calls. The thing is, the kidnappers wouldn't settle for the money, so they killed Mike. Now I don't know who's gonna be next," Jack said. "You now do not draw out, and while you rest here, we with Blogger Typhoon will go on a business trip to the nursing home. Then we'll figure out how to live further," said the grandfather. In the end, that's what they did. Now Jack stayed in Dubai, and the grandfather with the blogger and his crew went to the nursing home with a charitable mission. When the film crew arrived at the nursing home, everything was already prepared. Grandmothers and grandfathers put on their best outfits and waited for the next guests, which are few. Of course, they have seen many different patrons for their century, but it was the first time that a grandfather of their age in fashionable youth clothes. Having shown their viewers all the charms of senile life, the crew of Typhoon was about to leave, but something stopped Grandpa Carlo. Suddenly, out of nowhere, in the hallway of the nursing home, Grandpa saw Eva again. "We invited you. You've already come. Don't be in a hurry to leave," Eva said, walking past him in a white doctor's coat. Grandpa Carlo knows that Eva doesn't just come across him and give him advice, so there's some kind of mystery here. He turned to Typhoon and said, "Let's also show our viewers the rooms of the guests, how they live, how they spend their leisure time, and other details." So, they went from one room to another and filmed their plot. When in one of the rooms, Grandpa Carlo saw an old man lying in bed. He almost fainted. "Alexander, Alexander, I knew you had been kidnapped, and you were alive." Only Grandfather Alexander did not react to these words. He just looked at this stranger, who almost cried at seeing him. "He doesn't need to be disturbed. We found him in the park unconscious. He has completely lost his memory and can't even remember his name," the nurse said. Grandpa Carlo was sitting next to him, holding his friend's hand and crying quietly. "They got to you after all then. You fought them all your life, but they broke you. But your grandson Jack has accomplished his mission. Your manuscripts have been submitted, and soon the drug will be on the market and available to all suffering children. Your drug will bring them back to life. Soon everything will be as you dreamed and went to your dream," whispered Grandpa Carlo to his friend. At this point, the listless old man folded his arms across his chest and took a few heavy breaths. Everyone knew that the nameless grandfather had been struggling on the brink of life and death for days now. And now that he had heard the important news, his soul had decided to leave this world. As soon as his eyes closed, his face found bliss and a barely perceptible smile appeared. Such people are said to have left this life with a peaceful heart. Grandpa Carlo himself took care of the funeral arrangements until Jack flew in from Dubai. When Mark saw the competitor's number on his phone screen, he was a little surprised. Suddenly, he was getting a call from the Director of Global Health. "It's been a long time since I've heard from my dearest competitor, Frank. What are you doing here?" Mark was trying to sound as friendly as possible. "Mark, important business. Business only, nothing personal." I know you've been chasing old man Alexander's manuscripts for a long time. Well, we have the manuscript. I hope you haven't forgotten its value and won't haggle with me over its worth." Frank asked. "Is it definitely his manuscript? If they are, there's no talk of money. The most important thing for me is to get my hands on them and hide them safely so that my business of supplying cancer drugs from abroad is no longer threatened," said Mark. The deal went through within the next week. Global Health made 5 times more money than it had paid Jack. Mark, as he had planned, put Alexander's manuscripts somewhere in the depths of his safe so that no one else could get their hands on them. Now, nothing threatened his pharmaceutical business. Only from the windows of the hospital gray-walled children's eyes looked at the rays of sunlight that fall on the colorful playground. After Cecilia and Arnold were completely cured with Alexander's drug, hundreds of parents had hope. But the available supply of the legendary Alexander drug has already run out. Unfortunately, the recipe for the drug still lies in a remote corner of the vault villain Mark, and his business is only thriving and gaining momentum. Mark did not notice that behind him at this moment stood a mysterious girl, Eva.
Thank you for watching this video to the end. Subscribe to the channel. Like it, write comments if you like the story, and see you on the channel.